Okay, guys, welcome back. So, in this unit, we're going to spend a little bit more time going over these pressure changes again with ventilation. So, again, just as a reminder, we have these four pressures that are associated with ventilation. Again, our atmospheric pressure, which is a pressure outside of the air at sea level, which is 760 millimeters of mercury, or corresponding to 1 atmosphere, or 1 atm. We have our intrapulmonary pressure, or alveolar pressure, which is the pressure that's in the lungs, which will vary with ventilation depending on the cycle. Again, during inspiration, it is less than atmospheric pressure. When the pressure is lower than atmospheric pressure, it allows air to flow into the lungs. Again, if it's less than atmospheric, the pressure in the atmosphere will be higher. The pressure in the lungs will be lower. Pressure, moves from high to low. Air flows into the lungs. During expiration, the pressure in the lungs and the alveoli are greater than atmospheric pressure, and that causes air to flow out of the lungs because now it is higher than atmospheric pressure. Air flows from a high pressure situation then in the lungs to the atmosphere, high to low. So by moving or affecting the pressure in the lungs, it allows us to either move air in or out. And again, we make all our pressure units relative to atmospheric just to make it a little bit easier to understand. Instead of remembering 760 or 755 or however these things change, our reference point's always atmosphere because that's where the air that we're breathing in is coming from and it's where we're sending it out. So we always just compare it to atmosphere. And that stays pretty consistent. All right. And then we have our intrapleural pressure, which will also vary with ventilation. That is, again, always slightly negative, and during breathing, it only just becomes more negative, right? It never goes back, it never becomes positive. If it becomes positive, we run into some problems. Because remember, our lungs and our chest wall are in that should be in that dynamic balance. The lung walls wants to pull inward. That's due to the elastic forces as well as the surface tension in the lungs, and the outward pull of the chest wall, which wants to pull it towards the spine. Okay, and this balance and tension between these elastic forces create the potential space in the pleural sac, which creates this negative pressure environment for the lungs to sit within. Okay, and then we have transpulmonary pressure, which is the difference between the intrapleural pressure and the intrapulmonary pressure. And this will make more sense when we kind of go over some figures here. So again, we've shown this image before, right? Again, remembering that the lungs, due to their elastin, again, which is 30% of their weight, as well as the surface tension of the alveoli, have the tendency, they want to pull in, as we see in this graph here. They want to pull in this way. The chest wall, due to its orientation, wants to pull out. These forces at the end of, before we begin to breathe in, at the end of expiration, are in balance. Okay, we call that actually the FRC, or functional residual capacity, but that's not super important just yet. So remembering, before we breathe in, these forces are in balance, and the balance of these forces creates the pleural space. Okay, so again, that pleural space, a pleural sac, is negative pressure. And we can affect this by, expanding the thoracic wall. So as we breathe in, we pull the chest wall further away. This creates greater volume in the pleural space, which decreases the pressure even more, which allows the lungs to expand even further, which increases their volume and therefore decreases their pressure. And we allow air to flow in to the lungs. Okay, it's all by changing the pressure in the pleural space, which affects, decreases the compression against the lung relatively and allows the lungs to expand further, and they fill with air. So I think one of the easiest way to look at this is this little image here. So under resting conditions, again, in the intrapleural space, these again are relative to atmosphere, so it's -5 centimeters of water or millimeters of water. For reference, millimeters of water versus centimeters of water, it's about 0.73 centimeters of water per millimeter of mercury. They're about the same, equals 1 centimeter. It's a little bit less of water. right? So they're, roughly, again, about 5 below atmospheric. As we breathe in, we make that pressure even more negative. Again, that's because we're expanding the thoracic cavity, okay, the thoracic wall, by the respiratory muscles acting upon it, both the diaphragm and those accessory quote unquote muscles. At resting conditions, again, intrapulmonary or alveolar pressure is 0. It's equal to atmospheric. Okay, so there is no airflow coming into the lungs, right? They're at atmospheric. As we breathe in, and this is resting conditions, we lower the pressure in the alveoli a little bit below atmospheric. This allows air to enter into the lungs. As we expire, we notice now it's a little bit above atmospheric. And again, if pressure is higher than atmospheric in the lungs, air is going to flow out of the lungs. And I want you guys to appreciate, under resting conditions, quiet breathing, these are very small changes. We're not making huge wholesale changes in pressure. We're only really needing to generate, again, probably about, 5 centimeters of water, roughly, for a quiet breath. And remembering our respiratory muscles are able to generate about 100 centimeters of water of pressure. So it's very, very, we're like, I guess 5% of our 1 rep max to breathe every breath. So we're very, very, very efficient, high reserve. So this graph, I think, kind of demonstrates this quite nicely here. So as we start, at rest, again, this is before inspiration, at the end of expiration, when those forces in the chest wall and the lung are balanced, right? Our pleural space, again, like we mentioned, because of that force coupling, is about -5 in respect to atmospheric. And then the pressure in the lungs is, 0. It's at atmospheric. As we begin to breathe in, right, as the diaphragm descends and contracts, our accessory muscles contract, our scalenes and cervicothomastoid, which lift the upper chest, we increase thoracic volume, right, and moves outward, which increases the pleural cavity space slightly, and intrapleural pressure begins to decrease even more. And it has, the intrapleural pressure has to become more negative, remembering because alveolar pressure is 0, right? So if, we don't make the intrapleural pressure more negative, there won't be a negative gradient to allow air to enter into the lung. Because remembering the air is at 0, it's at equilibrium with the atmosphere. So we got to make it more negative to allow air to flow into the lung. So as we breathe in, as the diaphragm contracts and descends and acts upon the chest wall, it moves out the chest wall, the pleural cavity increases slightly, decreasing intrapleural pressure. That causes a concomitant increase in lung volume, and then a decrease in alveolar pressure as we begin to breathe in. And we continue this kind of train as we breathe in, breathing in, lowering pressure. Alveolar pressure continues to decrease, and air begins to fill into the lungs, right? The lung volume increases, and we're filling more and more of it with air. As we fill our lungs with air, again, remembering we're continuing to fill, our lungs are filling. When we get to expiration, we notice that alveolar pressure, right, starts to go up a little bit higher. This is because now we're getting into those recoil forces. Remember, we talked about we've wound up the coils of elastin, right? Because we filled the lungs with more air, they're more stretched, right? So they have that tendency to want to pull back in. We've also decreased the outward pull of the chest wall because we're moving kind of towards the direction it's pulling. So the shift then favors the lungs recoiling upon themselves. So we have a recoil. And so we're recoiling, we're starting to compress the chest wall, the lungs are starting to pull back in. and they're not pulling back in on empty lungs, remembering the lungs are filling with more and more air. So basically, we filled our canister, right, our can, and now we're compressing it, right? So while pleural pressure, as the thoracic cavity goes back to its normal resting state, the pleural pressure will will move towards zero, or move towards a less negative position, never actually approaching zero. It's becoming less negative. Alveolar pressure, because we've filled that potential space in the lungs with more and more air, becomes slightly positive relative to atmosphere, right? So again, just recapping, at the beginning of inspiration, right, just before we begin, alveolar pressure is at 0. Pleural pressure, again, -5, and again, these are relative to atmospheric. As we expand the chest wall, pleural pressure becomes more negative. It moves from like -5 to -8. That allows the lungs to fill with more and more air. Lung volume increases, and pulmonary pressure decreases. Pulmonary pressure decreases. This allows the lungs to fill with more and more air. As we get to a point during the end of expiration, because of the recoil forces in the lungs now being kind of wound up, there's going to be a recoil to pull the lungs back towards themselves. The chest wall will recoil as well with that force coupling relationship, which is connected through the pleural space and the pleural fluid. This causes pleural pressure to go back to its resting position, so it becomes less negative. We're starting to compress the lungs essentially, but as the lungs during expiration, we're filling with air, with more and more air. There's more gas in the lungs, so we're compressing, right? We're decreasing now the volume in the lungs while they have all of that pressure or that gas contained in them. That raises alveolar pressure over atmospheric, becomes positive, and air begins to flow out of the lungs. Okay? And then continues all the way till we finish expiration, and then we begin again. So again, it's all by dictating these changes in pleural pressure, which acts upon the lungs, which decreases the pressure by increasing the volume in the lungs, allowing air to fill. The lungs fill and fill with more air. We get to a point where the lungs are full as much as they can be, or as they need to be, and then we have compression due to the recoil of the lungs, which pulls the chest wall back, squeezes out, decreases the volume in the pleural space, decreases or increases the pressure in the alveoli, which force air out of the lungs. Completely passive. Again, it's all about these changes in pressures. And again, this is a graph here that's demonstrating this again. These changes in alveolar pressure, as we decrease, we fill the lungs with more and more and more air. We get to the end of inspiration, they're full. We have the recoil of the chest wall and the lungs, which then begin to push on those filled alveoli, which force air out of the lungs, right? It's completely passive due to these recoil forces, okay? So as lung volume increases, it fills, and then with that recoil, it raises the pressure in the alveoli greater than atmospheric, and then volume, we start to move more and more volume out of the lungs back to that resting position. And this is just another graph here that demonstrates that same concept again. So the numbers outside of the airway represent the intrapleural pressure, right? So this would be these values here, which are always negative. These are, again, relative to atmosphere. The numbers inside the airway represent the intrapulmonary alveolar pressure. So remember, pre-inspiration, they're at 0. Okay? And then the number in the circle, these guys here, represent the transpulmonary pressure, which again is the pressure in the alveoli minus the pressure in the pleura, right? So alveolar minus pleura. And because the pleural pressure is always negative, this value should always be positive, because we always want the pressure in the airways to be a little bit greater than the pleura to keep the alveoli open. If the pressure contained in the airways is greater, right, it will be able to push open and keep the lungs open. If the pressure in the pleura get too great, it will compress the alveoli. That's not a good thing, right? So we always want this value to be positive because it keeps the airways and alveoli open. It's greater than the pleura, right? If the pressure in the pleura was greater than it was in the airways, it would compress. It would compress the airways. So during inspiration, again, the airways are open because they are at atmospheric air pressure. The pleurae are negative atmospheric. Keeps the lungs inflated, keeps the airways open, right, able to push basically open because their pressure is greater. During inspiration, we lower the pressure in the pleura, which allows the airways to open or to push out a little bit, or push out even more to allow the air to flow into the lungs. During expiration, remembering again, during expiration, this now is leveled back off of atmospheric. We've equaled out that initial reduction in pressure, and we have compression against the lungs, forcing air out of the lungs. So again, it's key to remember that this process is continuous, and it's all about these dictating. It's dictated by these changes in pressure. So in terms of coughing, so the mechanics of coughing can be broken down into 3 phases. So we have our inspiratory phase, basically we generate enough volume to build enough pressure. We have compression, so we close the larynx, and then basically we have contraction of the diaphragm, the abdominal wall, to drastically raise thoracic pressure. Like we generate a lot of pressure, so we fill our lungs with air, our airways with air. We compress the airways using our abdomen, our chest wall muscles, which raise interthoracic pressure in the airways. And then as the glottis opens, we've basically created a pressure cannon, and it expectorates that that gunk in our lungs. So again, we take in a large volume, we then compress it, build pressure, build pressure, build pressure. We open up the seal, which is the epiglottis, and that expectorates or propels that debris out of our lungs. Again, we often do this with the mucociliary escalator, which traps that debris, brings up the carina, which triggers this reflex. Now, in terms of lung volumes, we'll get more into this later on, but we have set values that we can look at to appreciate how much volume someone can move in and out of their lungs. So total lung capacity would be the maximum amount of air contained in the lung at the end of a maximum inspiration. That's roughly about 5 to 7 liters in most healthy individuals. Then we have our vital capacity, which is a maximum amount of gas that can be breathed out of the lungs after a maximum inspiration. You may see this as the FVC, or forced vital capacity, which means that is a forced maneuver. Tidal volume is the volume of expired gas during an unforced respiratory cycle or quiet breathing. The residual volume, corresponds to the air that always remains in the lungs, even after a forced maneuver, right? There's always a little bit of air remaining in the lungs. A lot of that's nitrogen and inert gas that doesn't diffuse, and that gas still helps keep the lungs inflated. We have our expiratory reserve volume, so the remainder of air that we can breathe out, compared to a tidal or resting volume, so our ERV. And then we have our inspiratory reserve volume, which is the basically the reserve we have from breathing in, compared to tidal or resting breathing, right? So we have our reserve to breathe in, the reserve we have to breathe out, the total amount we can breathe out, and that's the amount that always remains even if we fully move all of the air out of our breath. Functional residual capacity, or FRC, is the volume that is contained in the lungs after a normal quiet breath. Remember, we talked about how those forces from the lungs that want to pull in and the chest wall that wants to pull out. Well, the volume where that occurs at a tidal breath is the functional residual capacity. Because we don't fully go to residual volume every time we breathe a quiet breath, right? We don't go all the way to the bottom here. We kind of hover a bit above it, and the volume that still remains in the lungs at that equilibrium point where the lungs and the chest wall are balanced is the functional residual capacity. So again, a little bit different than the residual volume, which is measured during a force maneuver. These are just our values here. The other important value that you might appreciate on a PFT is the diffusion of lung, or DLCO, diffusion of carbon monoxide. We'll get more into that. That should be above 80%. And then we'll also cover the maximum voluntary ventilation later on when we start looking at pulmonary function testing. So I hope this was valuable to you guys. Next, we'll cover the pulmonary circulation, and you'll see more of this PFT stuff in later lectures. Thank you.